and sometimes disturbing exploration of the state of healthcare and what it means for you. Now, here's your host, Dr. Eckel.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Greg Eckel, and this is What the Health. And boy, do I have a treat for you. My guest today is Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She is an MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She is in Cambridge, well, actually, you're not in Cambridge, but that's where you teach, is out in Cambridge, Mass. And, you've got a BS degree from MIT in biology, a PhD from MIT in electrical engineering, and computer science, and your career and research has really, over the last decade, has really switched,
Yes,
into
absolutely. Totally different. Yes.
Into the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and disease, with a special emphasis on pervasive herbicide, Roundup, and the mineral sulfur. And, this is super fascinating. You've been doing some work with my great friend and colleague, Dr. Greg Nye, and I am so excited to have you on the show today.
What happened?
I'm not sure. We paused.
We had a little gap there.
Yes. So we'll have you keep going. Our topic today is glyphosate and health. And we have a lot of ground to cover today. So I'm really excited for it. You have been doing so much work with regards to glyphosate, and we've had some conversations already, and just your extensive published research as well, and really building a case, which I would say, and you're not saying it, but I'm saying it, is a crime against humanity of this substance getting into our environment. And, I walk through the grocery store and you've got Roundup. It's just everywhere. It's in our grocery stores. It's at the, at the mall. I mean, it's just everywhere. It's ubiquitous. What are you finding? I mean, if I just kind of lob that over to you, because I know you can go all over the place with that.
Yeah. Well, basically, I was looking for the answer to what was causing the autism epidemic. And this journey started maybe 12, 13 years ago. And I looked at a lot of things for 5 years, and I knew I hadn't found the answer yet. I knew a lot more about autism at that point than I had at the beginning, but I still didn't know what was causing the epidemic. And it was really just completely serendipitous that I happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber was speaking about glyphosate. I did not know what glyphosate was, I'm embarrassed to say, at that point, 7 years ago. I thought, well, this is interesting. Let me go see what he has to say. And when I heard this 2-hour presentation, it was an epiphany for me. I became convinced this is my answer. And I was right. I mean, it was so amazing because I just dropped everything else and started learning everything I could about glyphosate. And the more I studied it, the more alarmed I became. And perfect correlation, in terms of the use of glyphosate, perfectly correlates with the rise in autism in first grade, 6-year-olds. It's a perfect match, a 0.99 correlation. I mean, you don't see that kind of correlation normally.
Wow. So, you're just showing them both coinciding at the same time. There's other things that this correlates with as well. You've got it associated with gluten intolerance.
Absolutely. Gluten intolerance matches well with glyphosate usage on wheat, which of course is the food that produces the gluten that causes the intolerance. If you look at corn and soy, it doesn't match so well. It matches better with wheat, glyphosate usage on wheat. Which makes sense because there's glyphosate in the wheat that's causing the gluten intolerance. I'm pretty sure that's the reason why we have that epidemic as well.
Interesting. And that's why I think some of my patients can go to Europe and have the wheat and not have any issue with it.
Yes, I've heard that. People have contacted me through email and told me the same thing. They go to Europe, the bread is fine, they come back here and it's toxic again. And we use a lot more glyphosate on our foods than Europe does. It's actually the Canadian government is the best example of a government that has tested over 8,000 different food samples for glyphosate residues at the insistence of a person who's a friend of mine who was just determined to get them to do that. And they did, and he published a book. His name is Tony Mitra. He's a Canadian citizen. He published a book called Poison Foods of North America. an apt title because Canada was looking at imports from Europe, imports from Mexico, from the US, and Canadian food. And they found a consistent pattern that the United States and Canada had by far the highest contamination levels of glyphosate in the food products. Sometimes even organic from the US or Canada had higher levels than non-organic from Europe for some foods.
Wow. How does that happen? Just drift on the fields, or?
Yeah, we've got it. So it's so pervasive in our environment. They can't use it. I mean, unless they're doing something illegal for the organic, consumer market. I buy certified organic when I shop at the grocery store for everything. I really believe in that. And that will reduce your burden, but it won't eliminate it because of it being so pervasive in our environment. And actually, Mexico came out really pretty much in line with Europe. So I tend to favor Mexico. If I can see the food comes from Mexico, it's likely to have less glyphosate in it.
Interesting. Less glyphosate from Mexico than from U.S. organic, or
That's
no?
No, not necessarily.
Just,
No, organic
just
usually,
U.S. regular.
US
Got it.
non-organic would be probably higher on average than Mexican non-organic, and probably organic comparison would also be less from Mexico, but organic would be considerably less than non-organic usually.
And it's basically, the message is you either pay now for your food or you pay later with your health, right?
That's right. And of course, it's a lot more than money that's at stake, because when you become so miserable you can't get out of bed, I mean, that is really a pretty nasty life to live. And if you can protect yourself from something like that, it is totally worth it. So it's not just the money, of course, it's the lifestyle change that you're going to have if you end up with a child with autism. I mean, you really have to think about it in those terms. And I really encourage anybody listening to really seriously consider switching over to certified organic for all foods. I think it's a really, really a big win. You will not regret the extra money you have to spend for the certified organic.
I full on am in alignment and agreement. And I think that's how we create the new economy, is we really start voting with our dollars, which really our health depends on it, as well as the health of the planet depends on it.
I know, it's so beautiful because you can feel you're helping yourself, but you're also helping the planet at the same time. And you're encouraging the farmers, because if the farmers start to see the value of organic, and of course they don't want to be poisoned either, they're going to start to think about converting to organic, and I wish the government would do things like, give them a free ride to get them to be able to live through those few years when they're not yet organic because they can't get the glyphosate out of the soil. They have to spend a few years to get to the point where they can convert to organic. And those years are painful because they can't sell their product as an organic label. So it's costly for them. A lot of farmers can't get over that hurdle. The government could do a big service to help them get over that hurdle and get them to convert to organic. And I would love to see that happen,
That would be awesome as a huge policy shift. So you're able to rehab, the farmers are able to actually get the glyphosate out of the soil, though?
It's something that's being studied. There are people who are working on exactly that. And if you put the right nutrients into the soil, particularly microbes that can break glyphosate down, for example, and sunlight helps to break it down. So you can sort of, time will break it down. Glyphosate, Monsanto claims it breaks down very quickly, like in a couple of weeks in the soil, but that's simply not true. I mean, it may be true in the optimum case, but in general, it lingers for a long time. And in fact, a study in Brazil has shown that the level of glyphosate in the soil is going up every year. So there's new glyphosate that's accumulating faster than it's being disappeared, so that it's increasing in the soil every year.
Geez. So let's back it up and talk about what is the glyphosate and basically Roundup in general. I think, I've mentioned to you, Professor Sarieah is one of my heroes on the planet. And his lab was showing Roundup is about 99 times more toxic than just glyphosate, which is the listed active constituent in Roundup. What's going on there? What are we talking about?
Well, that's really interesting. And many studies have shown that when you look at glyphosate in isolation, you often don't see nearly the kind of damage that you see in a study. For example, in an in vitro study, you don't see nearly as much damage to the cells in culture as you would if you put in the Roundup formulation. And this is a very disturbing thing that Sarieah has made a big deal out of, that the industry has only been required to test their product in isolation. But then when they make the formulation to make it be more toxic to the weeds. And they're very good at that. And they add these extra ingredients, first of all, that allow the glyphosate to get into the cells, number one, but also that are intrinsically toxic in and of themselves. Things like POEA. I mean, they add these surfactants, and those have not been tested at all for toxicity. Somehow the industry managed to convince the governments that you only have to prove this one product that's in there, this one chemical that's in there, if that's not toxic, or if it appears not to be toxic through your studies, which are carefully contrived so as to prevent you from seeing that toxicity. And they know how to do that. So they haven't studied glyphosate in the context of the environment in which they use it in these formulations.
Wow. So this, I mean, this is really, it's just every time that we talk and I get in on the research, it is very alarming. I mean, we're seeing this product in children's cereals. I mean, it's got drift into organics. How is it affecting our bodies?
Yeah, it's amazing. I tell you, it's a story that just keeps on giving, because the more I read, the more I find out, and I'm just increasingly astonished by new material that I'm learning. Continual journey on my part. And as I said to you earlier, I've written a book. It's not published yet. It's under review with the publisher, and I'm hoping it'll come out sometime this year on glyphosate. And I explain my interpretation of its mechanism of toxicity in that book, which I think is really, really interesting. So first of all, it disrupts a critical protein an enzyme in the shikimate pathway. The shikimate pathway is a very important biological pathway in plants. It's also very important in microbes. Many different microbes depend on the shikimate pathway. And human cells don't have the pathway at all, and that's why they argue we're immune to glyphosate, because we can't be affected by that particular enzyme since we don't even make that enzyme. It's a good argument, and it sounds great, and makes you'd want to believe that. But of course, a big problem is that our gut microbes do have that pathway, and they use it to make things that are essential for us because we can't make them. So the things that pathway makes are very important nutrients that our cells can't make. They depend on the microbes and on the food sources to supply our body with those nutrients.
Like what? Like what?
Well, okay, so it's the aromatic amino acids, which is phenylalanine, tryptophan, and tyrosine. And those are three of the amino acids that are the coding amino acids of the proteins. The DNA code, which is very famous in biology, that comes out of the chromosomes. The 4-letter code, that code codes for these 20 amino acids, 3 of which are coming out of that shikimate pathway. So when there's certain amino acids that are essential for us because our cells can't make them. And our cells are actually pretty impoverished. There's lots of things they can't do, and they depend on our microbes. You know, even to make different vitamins, for example, we can't make the vitamins ourselves. We depend upon our microbes to make those for us, or we get them from our food sources. So all of those things become deficient. In fact, some of the vitamins even come out of that shikimate pathway, like folic acid, which is very important for development, is a product. It comes out of that shikimate pathway. And also those aromatic amino acids, first of all, they're in the proteins, and the proteins are the workhorses of the body. So those 3 aromatics are essential for you to make proteins. But also they are precursors to the neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin, melatonin, thyroid hormone, and the skin tanning agent melanin, and so there's many essential molecules in our biology that come out of that shikimate pathway. All of them are going to get disrupted. In fact, studies on mice have shown that glyphosate disrupts the gut microbiome and in turn induces serotonin deficiency in the brain, and it shows behaviors that are characteristic such as depression. So those mice actually demonstrate depressive behavior as a consequence of glyphosate exposure disrupting the supply of serotonin to the brain.
Wow. So it's implicated in basically what you just said there was it's in neurodegeneration with the proteins and protein misfolding. It's on mental emotional component with the depression. Probably anxiety level is in that as well.
Absolutely.
And then with the melanin, that's a cancer that's implicated in cancer.
Yeah, right. Well, of course, melanin is the skin tanning agent that protects you from skin cancer. So we have an epidemic in skin cancer that is the worst myeloma, the worst skin cancer. We have an epidemic in that. It's going up actually in step with the rise in the use of sunscreen, very interestingly.
Right.
So the more sunscreen we use, the more cancer we get. I think part of the problem is the glyphosate, because a lot of people say to me, I can't tan. I go outside, I turn red and then I turn white. I never get tanned. People tell me that. I have to use sunscreen because I'll burn. They tell me things like that. And if you can't make melanin, you're not going to be able to tan. And tanning is what is the body's natural protection from the sun. So glyphosate's basically disrupting our ability to protect our skin from skin cancer through
Geez.
that mechanism.
Now, you had mentioned to me in a previous interview around, so the glyphosate has a glycine on its base, and that is implanting into it's displacing glycine off of our DNA strands.
In our proteins. That's just my theory. It's something that Anthony Samsel suggested to me many years ago, and I really bought into it, and I started studying it to see if it could be true. And in fact, it was a real eye-opener, because once I accept that that's happening, I can explain all the correlations. Like, I can pick a disease and find exact genes that are going to be affected in such a way as to produce the symptoms of that disease, and those diseases are going up exactly in step with glyphosate. It's a giant puzzle, and it works beautifully. And that's a lot of what my book talks about, is different proteins that are going to be predicted to be affected in specific ways that are going to cause specific symptoms of diseases that are going up exactly in step with glyphosate. And there are many, many diseases that are going up dramatically in today's society.
Indeed. And we're just kind of swimming in this solution that has been dubbed safe for humans.
Yes.
So on the microbiome, I mean, we're seeing a ton of research come out around neurologic health, brain health, longevity, even around cancer, starting in the gut.
Absolutely. And of course, things like multiple sclerosis and arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, all these things trace back to the gut. Parkinson's disease, they're finding the earliest symptoms are gut related, and then eventually the gut gets sufficiently disrupted that it starts to cause these gut external symptoms, partly because the gut becomes leaky. And glyphosate has been shown to cause a leaky gut in experiments. By researchers have published studies that show that glyphosate induces a leaky gut. And that's the beginning of a big, big problem, because you kill off so glyphosate preferentially kills off the good guys in the gut, the bifidobacteria and the lactobacillus. Lactobacillus deficiency is linked to anxiety, and anxiety is another one of these things that's going up exactly in step with glyphosate. We have a really big problem with anxiety, and people are taking all kinds of pills to help ease their anxiety in today's society. And I think the disruption of the lactobacillus is contributing to that. Bifidobacteria as well. Those are really important microbes in our gut. Normally for the baby, when the baby starts drinking breast milk, lactobacillus dominate the gut. They're like the main game in town. But what's happening is they're getting killed off by the glyphosate. And so these other species are coming in and things are getting imbalanced. And then you're getting toxic molecules produced by these other microbes that are causing disease. It's interesting when you look at the number of papers that were published on microbiome. I did this just looking at PubMed and counting the numbers over the years.
Yeah.
That is a good match to glyphosate with a delay of a few years. So you see the rise in the glyphosate usage, and then a few years later, you see the rise in the number of papers. The two curves match with a delay. So as we became exposed to glyphosate and more people got sick, and then papers started coming out, right? So we've become really, really interested in the gut microbiome recently, because we've become aware of how important the microbes are for our health, because they're being messed up. Before they were okay, now they're not. Once they're not working correctly, we see the consequences of that, because this is what's happening to us with the glyphosate poisoning.
With so two components. I'm guessing that you get a lot of dissenters saying, well, correlation is not causation.
Right.
How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, you have to say all these things are going up exponentially. All these diseases are going up exponentially. We've sort of accepted it that, oh yeah, this is what happens, modern times, modern lifestyle. Somehow, we don't know why, but everybody gets sick, right? We live longer maybe, but we all get sick. That's just how it is. It's like, we don't need to explain why that's happening. That really bugs me, that people just accept it. Of course, we have this rising rate of autism. That's just the way things are when you live in a civilized society. I mean, Hello, it's not true, right? There's got to be something that's causing it. And there are other things that are going up dramatically. And you're not going to look at something that's not going up dramatically to try to figure out. That's a first step. If you're going to try to figure out what's causing the problem, first qualification is it's got to match, right?
Right.
If it doesn't match the rise in disease, it's probably not the thing that's causing it. And so you eliminate a lot of things that way. You still do end up with some other things, such as vaccines. I mean, vaccines have really skyrocketed today compared to when I was a child. I got almost no vaccines as a child.
Right.
So that's one that I also worry about, certainly with respect to autism. and probably some of the other diseases, autoimmune disease in general, you can see, again, you need to understand what is the biology behind it. I won't say just because it correlates, that means it's happening.
Yeah.
You know, but if you can explain it through the biological mechanisms, then you have a lot more confidence in your correlation observation.
Yeah. And that's what you're showing in your research and
Right.
some of the other researchers that are coming out as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What, so this, I mean, it's so ubiquitous. It's almost as if like, okay, what do we do about that? But we'll get to that. What is the, can you go through kind of that theory that you're proposing of it coming in and displacing glycine out of the DNA? How does that play out for us?
That is truly, truly amazing. And I am very confident that I'm right at this point, even though I'm getting enormous pushback. I should warn you that most people think it's not possible. So I'm proposing something that even chemists will say is not possible. So you have to keep that in mind. However,
Okay.
I think it is so obvious that it's happening. And the fact is that there are examples of other toxins that work exactly that way, not with glycine, but with other amino acids. There are known toxins that cause disease by substituting for amino acids during protein synthesis. So that process is not new. Glyphosate is the only molecule I know of that specifically substitutes for glycine. But there are other molecules that substitute for other amino acids that cause disease. So the mechanism exists. It's just not the specific mechanism of glycine substitution. That's what's new with glyphosate, the only one that does glycine. But it is a perfect match to glycine. It is a complete glycine molecule. So it fits perfectly into the place to fit the puzzle piece for glycine, to fool the DNA when you build the protein. You know, the only problem with it is it has this extra stuff stuck on its nitrogen atom, which makes all the difference in the world. The nitrogen atom has to stay outside of the pocket because it has to attach up. These amino acids hold up hands like paper dolls, and they build this big chain. And the nitrogen is the one that has to link up to the chain. So it has to be outside of the pocket that fits perfectly with glycine. So in other words, glyphosate can fit because the nitrogen with its extra stuff on it can all be outside of the pocket. And the extra stuff might get in the way. If you have bulky amino acids next door, it might not fit and it probably won't substitute. But if you've got little guys, small amino acids, particularly to the left, if your amino acid to the left is small, there's room for that extra stuff that's stuck onto the nitrogen to fit into the space. But it will mess things up big time for the protein, and particularly for proteins that bind things that match the extra stuff that's on the nitrogen atom. So it becomes a really interesting puzzle because the nitrogen atom has an extra thing called methylphosphonate attached to it. And methylphosphonate looks a whole lot like phosphate. And phosphate is a super important molecule in biology. It has all kinds of roles, and many proteins bind to phosphate in important ways in order to do their job. So I look for, and those phosphate binding sites almost always have at least one very important glycine residue, often 2 or 3 very important glycine residues at the place where the phosphate binds. So you have a very specific set of rules to say which proteins are going to be affected. You can find them through the research literature, particularly if you find one that has, you have evidence that if that glycine gets substituted by, say, glutamate in a DNA mutation, and that causes a major disease, you can predict that glyphosate substitution for that glycine would cause the same effect, because glutamate looks a whole lot like glyphosate in terms of its biophysical properties. And it's
Got it. Oh, so that's all the excitatory disease processes that we're seeing with anxiety along those lines and inflammation in the brain.
Yeah, glyphosate actually does a whole bunch to mess up glutamate, causing glutamate excitotoxicity in the brain. That's been shown in multiple studies that it overexcites the glutamate receptors and causes neurons to go on fire, and it damages the neurons. That's well known, actually.
Yeah.
That's been shown experimentally.
With glyphosate doing that in the glycine's position. Wow.
Well, with it doing that, of course, if it messes up the enzyme that converts glutamate to glutamine, it'll do that. And that enzyme depends critically on a glycine residue that could get messed up by glyphosate. So I basically have this giant puzzle to work together, and it's quite interesting. It's quite exciting when you find a new paper that talks about a particular protein that has a place which I can recognize would be very susceptible to glyphosate.
Indeed.
And predict what it would do by looking at what happens. You can really make a lot of guesses about what would happen. And then when you see that there's a disease that's going up exactly in step with glyphosate, for which this particular protein's dysfunction is linked to that disease, then the whole puzzle comes together into a beautiful story.
Do you have, so on protein misfolding disorders and prions, I want to bring that up in this context as well. Is the same mechanism of action here?
Absolutely. In fact, the prions are really interesting because they have a particular pattern that's been established as the critical piece of those proteins that causes mischief. And that pattern is called GXXXG. So 2 glycines with 3 wildcards between them. And then that can go on for a long time. GXXX, 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 sometimes for 20. I mean, some of them can be really long, these GXXXG sequences. For example, the prion protein that causes a sheep prion
Scrappy.
disease,
Yeah.
scrappy. That thing is huge. It's like 20 glycines with this particular pattern. And then there's other ones like the one for deer that's I think 11 or something. I mean, and of course Alzheimer's also is like 3 of them. And then the prion proteins also have like 3 or 4. I forget, but the human prion proteins also have that pattern. So that pattern is characteristic of prion proteins. And those glycines are essential for the way the protein, to get the protein to fold into the structure that it needs to do its job correctly. And so when you put in the glyphosate, it messes up the way it folds, and it causes it to sort of crystallize, like it causes it to buddy up with other proteins of the same class and glom together with them and form these prion messes that cause the disease. Like a crystal.
Do they show then that kind of crystal structure? Is that then confirming other proteins to form the same? Is that how that it kind of spreads, or they're talking about it being an infectious agent, which I don't see being infectious at all, but I do see the confirmation, bias, like it'll start to spread.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like an example of a you always think of DNA as being crucial for anything to be. That's what was very unique, and the Nobel Prize was given to the guy who figured that out with the prion proteins. That you don't have to have a living organism; you just have to have the prion protein.
Right.
And it can cause the disease all by itself, which is really, really interesting. And not because it doesn't multiply itself, but it seeds a crystal. So once it gets in there and it makes the other proteins glom together with it to form this monster thing that causes the disease. It's really fascinating.
Got it. Yeah, that was Stanley Prusiner.
Right.
Yes. So these are unique, right? Because they don't have a DNA structure. It's just it's a seeding of a protein.
Yeah.
And this is, basically been my focus is around neurodegeneration and looking at, nobody is really talking about prions, and they're implicated in all of the conditions.
Right. It's really fascinating. Of course, Alzheimer's is also connected to that. Some people say that Alzheimer's is kind of like a prion disease, because it has the misfolding characteristics.
Totally. You get in on the prionic. I've got the second textbook of prion diseases, and they're all in there. You got Parkinson's, you got dementia, you have Alzheimer's. Anxiety can be grouped into that category as well.
Wow.
And really what it is it's all misfolded proteins. So this is like super fascinating that you're showing that the glyphosate, with the rise of the glyphosate use, there's more and more rates of autism.
Right. Yeah, Alzheimer's matches beautifully.
Parkinson's on the rise. And the argument of, well, we're just living longer.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not true, because we're getting more Alzheimer's at younger ages.
Right.
The age of onset is going down.
Wow. So it's staggering, really. So what, I guess, what do we do about it? Like, you've got a book coming out. I want to talk about that a little bit. You've got it on, basically what you found to date on your research, on some of the theories of how it's working. Where else do you see this like emerging trend, or other things that we need to keep in mind as consumers, as people on the planet, as providers, etc.?
You're asking what other diseases are?
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah. Well, of course, cancer is a big one, right? And about all these lawsuits for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I'm beginning to figure out. I mean, it's complicated as far as how it causes cancer, but this is where I'm going right now, trying to link it to interesting problems with deuterium, and that's like really fascinating to me. recently, the work I've been doing with trying to understand deuterium and how the body deals with it, and then how glyphosate disrupts the body's ability to deal with deuterium. And when you have deuterium toxicity in DNA, you get DNA damage. And DNA damage, of course, is the first step towards cancer. So I'm feeling like glyphosate's disruption of deuterium homeostasis is a key piece of the puzzle in the link between glyphosate and cancer. They've shown in terms of statistical trends, pancreatic cancer, liver cancer, thyroid cancer, those are all going up exactly in step with glyphosate usage. So those are some to think about as far as being correlated. I think breast cancer is also caused by glyphosate, but the data are not, don't fit because of the whole complication of the hormone replacement therapy. That's messed up the curve. Yeah.
Got it. What, so deuterium, maybe, folks haven't heard of that. What are we talking about there?
Yeah, really, really exciting stuff. And of course, it's complicated like everything else, but I've been just totally, I've been consumed by deuterium the last couple of months. Actually, It's quite recent for me.
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued. And you don't think about, I mean, I knew what deuterium was, but I didn't think about it at all until then. And it turns out what it is it's an atom. It's a heavy hydrogen. So hydrogen is the smallest element in chemistry. You have the chemical chart, periodic chart, which chemists have to practically memorize, but
yeah.
Hydrogen is the smallest. Very simple, 1 proton, 1 neutron, an atom. And deuterium, deuterium is 1 proton, 1 neutron, and 1 proton, 1 electron is hydrogen, and 1 proton, 1 neutron, and 1 electron is deuterium. So the neutron weighs essentially as much as the proton, and the electron weighs essentially nothing. So the deuterium is twice as heavy as the hydrogen. And it's present in very small amounts naturally in water. If you drink a glass of water, you're drinking deuterium. It's typically 155 parts per million in water. So sounds small, 155 parts per million. However, if you look at it in terms of its concentration in the blood, that comes out to be something like 4 or 5 times as much as calcium. So you think of calcium, it's an important nutrient, it's in the blood. You can measure it. Deuterium would be 4 or 5 times as high as calcium. So because there's so much hydrogen, even 155 parts per million is still a lot of molecules, a lot of atoms of deuterium that are going to be in your system. And hydrogen, of course, is super, super important everywhere in terms of reactions. It's basic in reactions. Although all the oxidative reduction reactions that go on to make all our, to break down our food, to make our nutrients, everything involves hydrogen all over the place. And deuterium behaves differently from hydrogen, but it gets stuck into those molecules randomly in various places and causes trouble. Because it doesn't behave the same. It's very sluggish. It won't react as fast as hydrogen, but also it'll mess up DNA and cause DNA damage. And it'll also mess up the fatty acids in the membranes of the cells. So the cells have figured out how to, it's so fascinating, the biology, the chemistry of the biochemistry of the mechanisms by which the biology make sure when it makes these certain molecules that are important, make sure there's very little deuterium in them. It has a way to trim out the deuterium in the reaction. It has special enzymes that can do that. And they're involved in the mitochondria, the citric acid cycle in the mitochondria, which is where you break down glucose to build ATP and supply energy to the cells. So the energy making system of the cells is in the mitochondria, and it in that system generates deuterium depleted water that it then uses to make deuterium depleted nutrients that then go into the DNA, go into the fatty acids, and make sure those things are safe. So the interesting thing is, if you just eat some butter, for example, butter has one of the lowest deuterium levels of any food, very low deuterium. And if you look at a woman, a nursing woman, you look at her saliva, you look at her blood, you look at her breast milk, you find the saliva has the most deuterium, the blood has less, and the breast milk has the least. So your body is actually, changing the concentration of deuterium in the things that it's making in important ways to keep you healthy, which is so interesting. And then it turns out that in order to maintain these reactions that are going to keep you safe from the deuterium, it involves critically a molecule called NADH or NADPH, which is very, very important in oxidation reduction reactions. NAD, not nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate.
I'm glad
And,
you said it.
yeah, NAD. I'm sure you've heard of NAD.
Yes, NAD. We use
really
it via IV all the time. Yes.
Okay, there you go. Really important and really screwed up by glyphosate. First of all, it's produced out of the shikimate pathway. It's one of the products of the shikimate pathway. So that's crucial because glyphosate messes that up. So it will provide a deficient supply of the raw NAD. But on top of that, I believe glyphosate is disrupting the enzymes that bring NAD, put the H back on NAD. So reduce it from NADP plus to NADPH or NAD plus to NADH. So that reaction that brings it back to that reduced state is getting messed up by glyphosate. The proteins that do that have highly conserved glycine residues at places that bind phosphate. That thing has, NADPH has 3 phosphates in it. Phosphate binding sites are places that are really sensitive to glyphosate substitution. And it's a complete setup that's very, very similar to what's going on in the enzyme in the shikimate pathway that gets disrupted by glyphosate. So in other words, I use the enzyme they know about as a model to look for other proteins that have a similar situation. I can predict those proteins will also be disrupted. And then I can determine that if glyphosate substitutes, it would disrupt them as well. Furthermore, glyphosate has been shown to disrupt the enzymes that are critically involved in this process of getting rid of the deuterium. Glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase is one of them, G6PD, which is super important in the red blood cells. And then also succinate dehydrogenase has been shown to be suppressed by glyphosate. All the dehydrogenases are trimming away the deuterium. It's so fascinating how that works. It's really interesting chemistry. NADPH and NADH. NADPH is essential for keeping glutathione in its reduced form. So oxidized glutathione is really big trouble in the liver, for example, liver toxicity, because glutathione is essential as an antioxidant. Not just in the liver, but the liver glutathione gets messed up by glyphosate, both depleted and too much of it in the oxidized form, which is not useful as an antioxidant. So it all makes sense that it's disrupting this NAD binding in the enzymes that are restoring NAD to its reduced form, which is needed to bring down glutathione to its reduced form to keep you safe from oxidative damage. Complicated chemistry, but very, very interesting.
Ooh, and that is far-reaching right there. That
really
is
significant.
So that is adding into the aging process and the breakdown of tissue. When you're talking about, glutathione and the oxidative stress protection, so that's from environmental toxicity. I always keep having Bruce Lipton's "It's the environment, stupid" quote in my head as you're talking there, around, where this is happening to our bodies and our bodies then are trying to react to it. I'm wondering if we can dive into, I'm guessing, viewers stick with us. I know that was a lot of chemistry.
I might have turned them off.
That was a lot of chemistry, but that was really great information for providers and also for you to understand. At least we've got researchers out there working on this stuff. But also it is far-reaching, and maybe we'll geek out a little bit more here. So we're down the rabbit hole already. So let's just stay down there. You and Greg Nye recently published a paper in the Journal of Water around, sulfur's role around cell membranes, right?
Absolutely. It's so interesting. And actually, I think that connects back to the deuterium as well. He and I are working on that right now. We've been exchanging emails like crazy and sharing ideas and trying to work out this story with the deuterium. We're both kind of hot on the trail.
Love it.
It's really fun. But we really believe now that, well, first of all, the sulfate in the membrane gels the water, and that makes the exclusion zone water, easy water. But it also pushes the protons out, so the water becomes negatively charged. Jerry Pollack has done a lot of work in this area, and he's popularized this whole idea of structured water and electricity. So it's actually supplying electricity to the cell. And what Greg and I think is happening is that the protons are being pushed out. Jerry has shown that the protons gather at the boundary between the structured water and the bulk water. So in the blood, you have the blood flowing through the artery, and you have this structured water along the edge, and the protons will gather at the place where the two meet. You have basically jello with water on top of it, and the protons are gathering right at the edge of the jello because they can't get inside the jello. The jello blocks them. And this then creates a battery, and batteries can produce energy. And so the body's energy supply, I believe, is controlled in a major way by the sulfate that is everywhere in the body. It sticks into these extracellular matrix components, creates the structured water, which creates the battery. And then those protons are gathered up and shipped into the cell along the cytoskeleton. This is what I believe. The cytoskeleton is actually electrical wires that provide the protons, that feed them into the mitochondria and provide the mitochondrial intermembrane space with a high proton concentration that it needs to be able to make the ATP. So it's really, really important. It's the source of electricity to make ATP, which is the energy, the fuel of the body in the mitochondria. Wow. It's really
so the
wild
huge
stuff.
So on the energy of the body we're talking about. Yes,
I think so. Yeah, it's really wild stuff. And the thing is, it's also protons rather than deuterons, because the deuterons, we're hypothesizing, and we're trying to get Jerry Pollack to do the study that'll prove it, that the deuterons will stay behind, so that you end up concentrating the deuterium inside the structured water, which then supplies deuterium depleted protons to the electrical supply, which is terrific because you're then protecting your DNA and your fatty acids from damage, because you're reducing the amount of deuterium that's going into those mitochondria. The mitochondria want to have very low deuterium inside that space where they're building up all those protons to make the ATP. They don't want deuterium in there, and you can keep it from being deuterium by virtue of creating this structured water. It's really wild stuff, and I know it's probably over the heads of most people that are listening, but
it was great. No, there is a discussion in our field around this, and there's a lot coming out about deuterium. And I guess even some folks are making, deuterium-rich water.
Deuterium depleted water,
Deuterium
DDW.
Depleted, right.
Yeah, well, they do both. In fact, some people were saying deuterium-rich water would be useful for fighting cancer. There's like some confusion of whether you want less or more.
Got it.
Which is interesting, because I think you want more deuterium in your extracellular matrix and less deuterium in your molecules that you're using, the building blocks for your DNA and for your lipid membranes. You want those to be low in deuterium. So your body needs to sort the deuterium out into a pile here and a depletion over there. That's what the body obsesses on, actually, it turns out. And glyphosate is like a train wreck for that whole process.
Wow. So it just throws it off. And are there concentration gradients of deuterium in the body then?
Well, I mean, this is what I was saying, is that if you trap the deuterium inside the matrix, like you have the extracellular matrix where you have all those sulfates, and if we're right that it makes sense to us that the deuterium would be more reluctant to leave, hydrogen is being lighter, would be able to move out, so that the deuterium tends to stay behind. So you end up with high deuterium water in the structure, and then you're pushing out protons, but not deuterons. So you're ending up with a lot of protons along the edge, but not so many deuterons, very few. So you've done a sorting right there by virtue of the exclusion zone water. The exclusion zone is doing the job of sorting out the deuterium.
I really think you guys are on to something big here.
We think so. We're so excited.
It's super exciting. It is super exciting because these are missing links of why we haven't had breakthroughs in certain conditions and why a lot of conditions are on the rise. It doesn't make sense in the current paradigm just to tox the body with chemotherapeutics for cancer, or really there's nothing in the neurodegenerative camp at this point.
I know, it's discouraging, isn't it?
This is huge. This is huge information. And thank you for the work that you're doing out there.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a study that shows that deuterium depleted water can prolong the lifespan of someone with breast cancer. They did a study where they gave some of the people different amounts of deuterium depleted water, and showed that it was protective, that it allowed them to live longer, that it increased their life expectancy following a cancer diagnosis. Really, really interesting.
Wow.
It's very, very expensive. They're marketing it on the web. But you can also get deuterium depleted food by simply eating a ketogenic diet. And I suspect that may be the benefit of a ketogenic diet. When you eat a lot of fats, you're eating deuterium depleted nutrients naturally, because the body makes fats that way.
Huh.
So that's an easier way to get, reduce your deuterium burden by simply eating a lot of fats, which is really interesting.
Wow. That's the first time I've heard of that. So that's a great one to go down in researching on. So what else do we have here? We've got you've got your book coming out. You said you might name it something else. I don't know if you want to
name.
Well,
I don't know. That's my title, but the editors might decide they want something different. We'll see. Hopefully that'll stay.
Okay.
Hopefully that'll stay.
We won't share it then. Everybody will have to watch. Look for this book coming out, and we'll make sure we get it posted and maybe have you back on and talk directly around that one. What do we do? I mean, so we've got glyphosate everywhere. We started out saying, okay, definitely eat organic foods. This is for your families. Please share this one with your loved ones out there if you're listening. We want you to get this information out, because you're not getting this one over the airwaves, right? The mainstream media, I'm guessing, is not so pleased with Dr. Seneff's findings or discussing this. But this is huge, far-reaching. I mean, the way that you just went through there, we talked about, okay, some major conditions that are on the rise that correlate. Then we got into the biochemistry of our bodies, of really energy production at the mitochondrial level, and on a repair mechanism with glutathione protecting us from oxidative stress and damage and basically environmental toxicity. So this one molecule, glyphosate, coming into our bodies can play this much havoc with us.
That's right. And in fact, it's been shown that glyphosate causes fatty liver disease at minute amounts. Studies on rats exposed to glyphosate below regulatory limits developed fatty liver disease in exposure to glyphosate. And I can explain how that would happen because of the disruption of the mitochondria that goes on with the glyphosate.
Wow, let's go through that. That sounds fun.
Yeah, well, I mentioned the succinate dehydrogenase deficiency, and that's one of the critical enzymes in the mitochondrial pathway. There's also PEPCK, phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase, which has a glycine residue highly conserved at a place that is exactly modeled after EPSP synthase. So EPSP synthase gets disrupted by glyphosate through a mechanism that's been well researched, and they've explained how there's a particular glycine residue at the place where it binds a phosphate in PEP. So it's phosphate binding at a site where the enzyme has a glycine residue. That's the pattern, a highly conserved glycine. And then you also have some other positively charged amino acids that will hold that phosphate in place. You have all of that set up around EPSP synthase. You have the same setup around PEPCK. So I predict that glyphosate would disrupt PEPCK, which is super, super important for generating those deuterium depleted nutrients that I mentioned that go into the fatty acids and go into the DNA. So your body can't make good versions of those things if it doesn't have PEPCK, but also PEPCK deficiency has been shown to cause fatty liver disease. So it really messes up the whole metabolism involved with the citric acid cycle, and gluconeogenesis and all kinds of things get messed up if PEPCK is not working. And
wow.
And one of the things that happens is fatty liver disease if PEPCK is broken. And so I am predicting that glyphosate is disrupting PEPCK to cause the observed fatty liver disease. All the metrics that they see several different liver metrics that get messed up by glyphosate along with the fatty liver, and they all match. They would all be explained by PEPCK deficiency.
Interesting.
So it makes
sense. So that one is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that is a silent epidemic in this country right now.
And it's huge. Children have it. I mean, it's just ridiculous how many people have fatty liver disease today. It's amazing. Total epidemic.
Now, so we're able to show that one to reverse with doing alpha lipoic acid via IV and vitamin E. Does that make sense with that?
That does make sense, because alpha lipoic acid is a sulfur-containing molecule.
Yeah.
I haven't studied it enough. It's on my list of things I want to learn more about, because I have heard that it's been a useful supplement. And you're doing it IV, right?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah,
That's
and
very interesting.
that's consistent across the board. We have really good success with that with the NAFLD.
That's very, very interesting. That's a nice tip. I'll have to go back and do some
Great.
digging to see if I can hook that into my story with the
I would love to see that. Yeah.
That would be really interesting. Yeah.
Well, so what do we do? So we know we have glyphosate in us. We can measure it in our bodies, right?
Yes.
And
it's
so we
coming up,
measure
and
it.
very commonly, most people are contaminated, I would say. It's very hard to not, if you're in this country, it's almost impossible to avoid.
So what are ways that we can clear that out of our system? Have you come across those?
Well, I have a lot of people who are trying different things, and with varying amounts of success. And there are some products out there, actually. Biomedic is one of them, and also Restore for Life. Those are two products that you can find on the web. I think they're based on probiotics and on fulvic acid and humic acid, which are organic matter from the soil. Those are often known to be good in general against toxic chemicals, and in particular against glyphosate. People have found effectiveness. There's a paper that I like to reference on cows, and the cows were sick. They measured urine, found the high levels of glyphosate in their urine. They gave them fulvic acid, humic acid, bentonite clay, and sauerkraut juice, interestingly enough, sauerkraut juice, which of course is a probiotic, right?
Yeah.
And they found a significant improvement, lower glyphosate levels, and improvement in their symptoms with those treatments.
Wow.
So people are, the animals are sick, of course, and so the veterinarians are learning how to deal with glyphosate toxicity through the experiments with the animals. But those are some interesting hints. I like to try to take apple cider vinegar on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
We eat a lot of salad. We make our own dressing. Just use this Bragg's organic apple cider vinegar, which I'm very fond of.
Lovely.
And it's a probiotic, and it might be that the bacteria that are in the apple cider vinegar, some of them may be able to break down glyphosate enzymatically. So I think it'd be really super to have microbes growing in your gut that can break down glyphosate. And some people probably do have a better supply of those microbes, and therefore they're less sensitive to glyphosate because it's being cleared by their gut microbes. So that's really important. So I think the apple cider vinegar could help you even in the oral cavity before you even get to the stomach, to kill the glyphosate before it ever gets into the system by breaking it down enzymatically. So that's a possibility. There are a few I'm trying to find out which microbes can break down glyphosate. Some of them are known to be, pathogens, like Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Can break down glyphosate, but you don't want to have a Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection because that's really bad. So, it's sort of tricky to get ones that are not bad guys that are able to metabolize the glyphosate without harming you.
Indeed. I've been doing a ton of gut testing with neurodegenerative patients. It's a component for Parkinson's as well. And coming up with some really novel approaches of re-establishing the microbiome and then having folks' symptoms improve.
Right.
So that's this is super exciting to know. Maybe I'll put in some headspace into the microbiome as well for breaking down glyphosate.
Yes, absolutely.
Because if we could have that in a food source that we're taking every day, we know we're getting exposed to it. It's almost as if we got to really bring back that herbal medicine that we're just having as part of our diet in detoxing from environmental exposure.
Right. I think it's a good idea if we could, in fact, just keep on supplying ourselves with microbes that could break it down. On a continuous basis, because we can't avoid glyphosate exposure.
Well, in closing, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners and viewers out there?
Well, certainly, I guess 2 more points I like to make is sulfur, eating a high sulfur diet. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of healthy foods are delicious that contain sulfur. And then also getting out in the sunlight. I really believe in that. And light as an energy source. I think light does really important things. The body has learned how to use sunlight very effectively to heal. And so I think sunlight exposure is really important.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Seneff.
Thank
for
you.
so much information today. I want to welcome everybody to share this show with your loved ones and your communities. If you're just tuning in, you missed a good one. So go to naturecuresclinic.com/podcast, subscribe to this on your favorite podcast show server. And we are here Tuesdays from 2 to 3 p.m. So please tune in to What the Health.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.